My kind of personal belief is that capitalism just diverted too much to focusing on profit and not looking at those wider impacts over the last 50 years. And we need to kind of change capitalism back to be a bit more kind of inclusive in nature.
Purposely Podcast, speaking with social entrepreneurs and charity founders and leaders, people who are making the world a better place. Here's your host, Mark Longbottom.
A really warm welcome to Purposely with Baytrust CEO Alastair Rhodes. Baytrust is one of 12 endowed foundations making a positive difference to their communities. They do this through grant making and other means. The Baytrust area of focus is the Bay of Plenty, which is found on New Zealand's eastern side of its North Island. It includes cities like Tauranga, Rotorua, as well as smaller enclaves like Turangi. Alastair is the chair of the Impact Investment Network. He has a real passion for impact investing. You'll hear his background in the commercial sector, particularly around air travel. Could I just ask you, before we jump into the show, if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, whatever platform you're on, if you could please hit follow, it really helps me to get the message up there. Enjoy. This episode of Purposely was brought to you by Benevity, all-in-one software solution that benefits employees, customers, non-profits, and society. Let's get back to the show. Alastair Rhodes, welcome to Purposely Podcast.
Oh, kia ora and welcome. It's great to be here, Mark.
You're the CEO of Baytrust. It's one of 12 community trusts in Aotearoa. What's its mission? What's its purpose?
Yeah, so the community trust model was quite unique around the world, but effectively it came out of the community savings banks. So we had a whole bunch of community savings banks, which was a UK kind of based model, which was set up in New Zealand. And as part of the banking deregulation in the late 80s, the government wanted to get more capital into the banking sector. So those community owned savings banks were effectively sold to commercial banks like the Westpac, etc., offshore. And the funds from those sales were actually put into these perpetual trusts. So 12 trusts, as you mentioned. And, basically our trust says, we're there to benefit our region. So very wide, very kind of broad base, but these perpetual kind of trusts that are there to kind of benefit the regions out of the banking deregulation days.
Yeah, and Baytrust is focused on the Bay of Plenty. So I'm just getting an idea of borders. So does that sort of go up to border with Waikato? We're talking about the eastern side of the North Island and then down this and bordering with the Hawke's Bay. Is that as far as it stretches?
Effectively. So, we have the major metropolitan areas of Tauranga, Rotorua, Whakatane and Taupo in our kind of region. So our definition of Bay of Plenty was based on the trust bank boundaries at that time. So it's a little bit different to everyone else. But yeah, our trusts that border us are Trust Waikato, or the Waikato kind of side, and Hawke's Bay, Eastern and Central Trust down that end of the country as well.
Wonderful.
And so I think in our region, about 350,000 people reside in our region. And effectively, everyone that resides in our region is our beneficiary. And so that's to some extent means under kind of trust law, we need to all actually, recognise that they're all beneficiaries and understand actually how we can be equitable across those beneficiaries as well.
Yeah, and half of those people living in Tauranga, just or almost half of those people. Yep. So, yeah, and that's where you guys are based?
Yeah. So pretty much half our population is based in the Western Bay of Plenty, which includes Tauranga, and our head office is based here, but we get around the region a lot, and it's a very diverse region. So, we've got pockets of the most deprived parts of New Zealand, especially around Eastern Bay of Plenty, to pockets of extreme wealth, for example, Mount Maunganui around Tauranga. So very diverse kind of region in terms of different challenges and needs. But, to some extent across the board, housing's a challenge wherever we kind of go. Environmental issues and climate change is a challenge wherever we go. They're just slightly different in different parts of our region.
Yeah, and so you guys are an endowed foundation. You haven't got any new inflows of money, so you don't do fundraising as such, but you benefit from investment, you benefit from, like how your funds are managed, the interest that you derive. What are the unique elements of running an endowed foundation? Because we'll go into your backstory, but relatively new for you when you joined. But what are the sort of unique elements of being a leader in that context?
Yeah, so we are endowed foundation. So when we were set up, we effectively had a trust fund that was the size around $90 million, and that was about 25, 30 years ago, and that's grown to $250 million. So some of the unique things is that we need to be fair to our current beneficiaries, but also fair to those future beneficiaries as well. So we look to grow our trust fund in size based in, growing in alignment with inflation, growing in alignment with kind of population increases. And that's one way we kind of look at it to ensure we're kind of equitable current versus kind of future beneficiaries. So that's, kind of an interesting, unique bit of the model. As you said, we don't, she's seeking kind of further funding. So we've got our own, investment fund, and it's a matter of just growing that, but growing it equitably and making sure we're granting sufficient into our community each year that we can look after those current and future beneficiaries at the same time.
And crucially, the governance of such assets is really important, isn't it? Because there's a unique model when it comes to community trust. So the government ultimately has the say on who that trustee board will, and they serve terms as well, don't they? Give us a bit of a flavour of how it's governed.
Yeah, so like our governance model, when we were first set up back 30 years ago, effectively we were a distribution committee for our banking, for a banking dividend. So it was set up as a distribution kind of committee trustee. We've just reviewed that in the last 3 or 4 years and updated that. So effectively what we've got now is it's quite a complex beast to kind of govern to some extent. So we've got 250 millions of investment, so we must have trustees with investment experience, but we also must have trustees that really represent the diversity of our community and understanding under government and philanthropy and actually how we do those distributions as well. So you're right. So because we came out of the banking deregulation days, our settler at the time was the Minister of Finance, and so a hangover from that is the Minister of Finance, or the Associate Minister of Finance in New Zealand, still looks after effectively our trustee appointment process. They're generally appointed on 4-year terms. So one of the good things about our model is, a 4-year term I think works really well, and then generally appointed for another term of 4 years. So we've got 12 trustees, and they're staggered that appointment process. So generally each year we might have kind of 2 coming up in terms of vacancies or 2 coming up in terms of renewal. And I think that works well. 8 years in the trust means that we have that kind of refresh coming through. And as you said, our Minister of Finance, so it is a political appointment process, but we've actually really strengthened our trustee and said things like we must have sufficient investment experience, we must actually have sufficient diversity in our communities. And that means that the political process needs to still comply with our trustees. So we also submit nominations ourselves and, really successful in getting the people that we need on the trust. So we've got a really good diverse group of trustees at the moment, 50% with whakapapa Māori, over 50% women, just from a diversity perspective, good investment skills as well. So we work closely with the Minister of Finance and our local MPs to make sure we get the right people to govern ourselves really well.
Yeah, and representation and skills, crucial elements of that.
Yeah.
And I think what you described is sort of managing up, if you like.
Yeah, effectively it is. And it's, so we're quite clear, because our trustees are not elected, they're not representational, but because there's kind of almost elements of representation in terms of our region and what we're going to do. Now, I think our optimum board size is a little bit bigger than usual kind of boards, because there is a little bit of a representational kind of element in there as well.
Yeah. And I guess when a trustee comes on, they're excited to be there. You guys have a significant profile. You're a large asset in the area. The person coming onto the board will represent a community typically. They might, say they might represent a certain ethnicity, but in terms of they're not there for themselves or for their background, are they? They're there for the greater good and there for the greater community.
And in our induction, we make it very clear, like you may come from Rotorua and be really passionate about Rotorua, and it's great that you've got those deep, really connections into Rotorua, but it's very clear once you're appointed as our trustee, actually you're there representing the Bay of Plenty as a whole, and you're there to do what's best for the Bay of Plenty as a whole. So we don't have segregated kind of budgets, which says, here's a grant budget for Rotorua versus a grants budget for Tauranga. Ultimately, we're here to do what's best for the Bay of Plenty. But one of the things we do is we look, on a quarterly kind of basis of where our granting goes across the region, and make sure, over a kind of a 2 or 3 year kind of staggered period, that it's equitable across our region as well.
Yeah. And interesting roles. So, very much part of it focus on finance and investment, the other part around having a lens and a focus on the community and understanding the issues. You divide, so just in terms of how you run, you've got a real personal interest on the investment side, haven't you? Is that, and you've got the community grant elements covered by other members of the staff, but is that the bit, the growing, the challenge of growing the endowment, bringing additional funds in, is that the bit that excites you personally?
Probably, yeah. So not actually growing our endowment, that doesn't excite me. Actually making a difference excites me. And I think, what's very clear to me is that, we've granted over $100 million into our region over the last 30 years, but our key metrics we measure, environmental degradation, youth unemployment, housing inequality, etc., are going worse. So for me, it's clear that no matter how much we grant in our region, it does good stuff, but it's not going to have that system change that we need. And actually where we need to get from a system change perspective is actually having that, that financial capital, that investment actually going into kind of things which care about the environment, our community, as well as investment returns. So that's probably my passion, is not necessarily growing our $250 million investment base, but actually having the most impact we possibly can with that $250 million investment base to kind of help lead capital, I suppose, into a more sustainable future.
Yeah, and some of the phrases that come to mind, like being the catalyzer, like walking in a humble way, side by side with community, all of those. But also the big change I've seen in community trusts is around way more strategic approach to the way they operate. Like, would that be the case for you guys and what you've seen elsewhere in the country?
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. When we look across the board, a lot of philanthropics like ourselves, and, we're part of the Community Trust family, which has got $5 billion investments. But, there is a realization that actually we're just not going to keep on doing the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff funding. Actually, if we want to have, make a difference in the community, and that's what trusts and endowment and foundations should be doing, ultimately it's how to maximize your impact. Actually, we need to look at more from a more of a system change perspective. We need to support more kind of advocacy. We need to support more getting investments into the right space. So, we see that across the board. We also know that, we've got to get that system change we need, we still need to do some of that base level kind of granting. Like, if we talk in some of our deprived regions, can you get system change into a deprived part of region if, the people are struggling to kind of feed themselves and afford to live? So there's the base level that we're always going to do, but system change is definitely kind of coming through really strongly across the board.
What's one thing you've learned, or a few things that you've learned in your 8 years in the role? Like, you think back to Alastair Rhodes, who came into the role 8 years ago.
Yeah, I suppose a number of things I've learned. One of the things that's when you get into an organisation like this, it's kind of, to some extent, it's very hard to leave. And that's why we've got really good staff tenure as well, because ultimately everything we do is there to, make the community a better place. So, very fortunate, privileged position to be in a role where, we can do a whole bunch of stuff with private equity, try and make as much financial, returns as we can. But it's rewarding because whatever, extra returns we make gets kind of put back into our community. So for me personally, it's a, very challenging role, but it's a very kind of enjoyable kind of role as well. And I think the other thing I've kind of learned is that, we do have to have that base level of granting, but granting is never going to fix the social issues out there. If you think about the big issues around climate change and housing, actually, our granting is never going to make a difference or a material difference, nor is the government's. Our balance sheet's not big enough, nor is the government's. It's that commercial capital, accessing, funds like KiwiSaver funds, etc., and getting them to invest long-term in a purpose, mission-based, ethical kind of way into housing solutions. That's what's going to make the difference. So for me, what I've kind of learned is what the base stuff that we've always done in the past is really important. We'll keep on doing that, but it's not going to move the dial. And so if you really want to move the dial, it's actually about using your kind of balance sheet and using more, investing and granting in terms of advocacy and support is what we need to do.
And changing tack for a minute and taking you way back to your youth and your childhood, you've ended up focused on a for-purpose career and very much focused on making a difference to your community. But growing up, what was the sort of conversation happening in the family? Was that a focus around purpose for you?
Kind of not at that granular detail, but effectively, I do think where I've ended up today has been, has come from my past. And I think, I go back a bit earlier than that. So when my great-granddad came to New Zealand, he came to New Zealand from the UK at the age of, I think it was 13, by himself, and his family and him, to seek better, opportunities for himself. And he had that. And so did my grandfather, so did my father, so did myself. But I look forward to the future generation and my children and go, actually, we'll have the same opportunity to swim in those rivers I used to swim in, the same job opportunities, the same opportunities in terms of the housing market. I don't know if they will. And I think, that's part of that, and that upbringing is going, actually, that's why I'm in my role here, because I want to create better opportunities for my family. But I go back to, my upbringing. So my dad was a head vet in the New Zealand Dairy Board. So, very well known across New Zealand, but his passion was really the environment and the outdoors. And that brought my passion around environment and climate change through. And then my mum was a public health nurse. And so again, looking after the people came through. And I think it's just naturally kind of evolved in terms of what I'm doing today. It really kind of fits my upbringing and, my passion and, to some extent, those deep values I've had. And when I started my career, I did a law and a commerce degree. And, I spent 5 years at university because I probably didn't really know what I was going to do. I always thought I'd kind of run some business myself at some stage. But my career's, I've worked overseas for large American companies like General Electric and Specsavers. I've worked for airlines and airports. And what I've learned from that career is that actually there's some great things in the commercial sector, like the understanding of the value of money, the understanding of actually how to build partnerships. But when you couple it with the not-for-profit sector, which has that, that purpose, that really purpose that aligns with your kind of values, that's where great things happen. And I think from a leadership perspective, if you can get people actually aligned with actually their own purpose, aligns with the organization's purpose, that's when you can actually have a really strong team as well.
Yeah. So I had down one of your first jobs was in tax for Deloitte. Was that right? So that was straight from you leaving university?
Yeah, so when you do a law and a commerce degree, you tend to kind of get snapped up by either one of the large accounting firms or one of the large legal law firms to go into their kind of tax practice, because they're looking for people with a commerce accounting background and also a legal kind of background at the same time. I had no passion for tax. I never thought I'd go in there, but effectively it was a really good grounding because it paid for my chartered accountancy, it paid for my legal kind of profs to get done. And, I have to admit, I didn't enjoy any of those 3 years at all. Tax is definitely not a passion for me, but it had some really good kind of grounding in terms of, work ethic, understanding how to write legal kind of opinions, understanding how to analyze accounts. So it gave me a really good foundation. And I think I did that because I knew it would allow me to explore my passions in the future. So I never thought I'd be a lawyer or an accountant, but it always gave me a backup that said, look, if all else fails, if I set up a business and it fails or something like that, I can go back and I can become an accountant or lawyer if I have to be. So it's really good grounding. And I still think, I use a lot of those skills today still. But yeah, it definitely wasn't me. 6-minute chargeable units. It's a challenge at the best of times.
And we touched on the aeroplanes overhead, and you've carved out a really good career in sort of, what did I say, airline commerce almost, and in New Zealand for a large stretch of that for 7 years. But how did that come into your scope?
Yeah, so that was, I came back from overseas and I actually set up a business with one of my friends, and we're doing producing a range of, outdoor kind of education outdoor projects, et cetera. And we needed some funding while that business was getting set up. So I ended up just contracting at Freedom Air, and it was just a really simple kind of contracting job. And I think life sometimes, things just kind of fall on your lap. So I was a contractor there, and then I think the company accountant actually ended up resigning. And so Freedom Air was a subsidiary from Air New Zealand, flew about 12 jets across the Tasman. And so, I ended up they go, oh, could you look after the company accountant role while we kind of appoint a new person into that role? And I was like, well, I'm not a company accountant, but I'll do it for a couple of months. And then I was in that role, and then their finance manager ended up resigning, and they were like, oh, can you pick up that role? And I was like, well, I'm not really a finance manager, but I'll double or triple my charge out rate and I can kind of do that role as well. So I ended up by kind of chance working there. And one of the good things about working there is the GM in charge of at the time, Stephen Jones, ended up being the head of strategy at Air New Zealand. And I suppose my passion was never around the financial side of things. I ended up looking after finance for the Tasman Pacific Airlines, which is a large airline group across Air New Zealand. But pretty much most of that time, I might have been in that role for 3 years. I was seconded out of that role to look after strategic projects. So doing all the Tasman kind of changes, working with Christopher Luxon to kind of really redo the international kind of airline. Then ended up looking after the ancillary revenue kind of part of that business as well, which is where most airlines make money. But what it taught me, I think, working at Air New Zealand actually was the value of actually how to understand and really drive a good strategy. And that's come through the rest of my career. And when I took the role at Bay Trust, I was like, well, I don't really know much about this sort of not-for-profit endowment foundation model. But I was like, well, actually, all it is really having a really good strategy about actually how to make money. And I can do that from an investment perspective because I've got a good background on that. But then you have to have another strategy about actually how to distribute that money as well. So you have kind of two overlapping kind of strategies. And when I first started Bay Trust, I kind of almost saw them as quite separate. But the more I worked there, the more they came together and go, actually, the best strategy is one in the middle where actually you are using your investments to also make impact at the same time. So I learned a lot. I worked with some fantastic people at Air New Zealand, like, as I said, Stephen Jones, the head of strategy, Rob Fife, Christopher Luxon, and they had the resources. So one of the projects I was pulled aside, 4 of us for pretty much, I think it was 9 months of unlimited resources and money to, reimagine the Tasman airline, which had lost money for 12 years in a row before we kind of actually, did a project on it. So a lot of those skills and techniques of how to drive really good strategy, I learned from them, and working with, experts like McKinsey, etc., has translated into my career. And that's probably my happy space, is thinking about the future and talking about the future and that strategy. It's not about the business as usual kind of granting all the details. That's not where I add value. My value is kind of more thinking about the future and how to get there.
Yeah. And so a couple of years as CEO of Rotorua Airport as well. And when that role came up at Bay Trust, take yourself back there, again, heading home and as maybe speaking to your partner or talking to friends and family, was it something you sort of stumbled across to sit in Ascend?
Oh, so very much. So I'd been at Rotorua Airport for 2 years, and I kind of said when I took that role, it was a good opportunity to move from Auckland rat race down to kind of the Bay of Plenty, which I always knew was a fantastic place to kind of raise a child. They had some big challenges at that airport at that stage in terms of they were trying to do international flights and it wasn't working and it was costing them millions of dollars a year. But I'd been in that role for 2 years and there was a massive opportunity, and there still is, to actually have a consolidated airport strategy around the Bay of Plenty region. There's like 4 or 5 airports operating, all doing their own thing. And just from a economics perspective, it made no sense. But I ended up getting quite frustrated with actually trying to deal with the political kind of tensions of actually being a CCO, reporting through to the council, and they had their political views which weren't necessarily aligned with my strategic views. But what I learned in that role was actually, if you think about a regional airport in New Zealand, most of them don't cover the cost of capital. They're there for other regional benefits as well, like employment, tourism, etc. So it started getting me to understand that kind of model, almost that impact investment model where you're investing in things, not just straight for financial returns. Councils invest in their regional airports, not straight for financial returns, but for those other wider regional kind of economic benefits. So I was doing that, and I hadn't actively started looking for another role at that stage. And then I think my mum might have seen it in the Sunday Star Times, which was a paper that used to exist here, just an advertisement for this. And she sent it to me, and I looked at it, and I was like, I don't really know much about this at all. And then I suppose, as I said earlier on, the more I looked at it, I was like, well, actually, it's Bay of Plenty wide, which I really enjoy because I think that some of the Bay of Plenty is bigger than the individual hearts. It's around making a difference to the community, using our investments to have, more of an impact rather than just straight financial return. That kind of aligns with what I do. And then I thought, well, actually, it's leading a team. I really enjoy leading a team, and you just have to have 2 complementary strategies. All I have to do is develop my thinking about a strategy of how to distribute money as well as a strategy of how to make money. So I came into that role, and I've enjoyed the last 6-7 years immensely. It's it's by far the most enjoyable role I ever have because whatever we do is about making a community a better place. And I think for me, I want to make it a better place for our children, our children's children in the future as well. So it really resonates strongly for me.
Yeah. And I imagine when you were, pitched into the trustees that you would have probably given quite a different option to them than may have been the other candidates in terms of your commercial and strategic value.
Oh, definitely. I think previously, and a lot of the other trusts have, got very much grant kind of managers. So my model I pitched was, if you want a CEO, it is actually about a strategy. It's a strategic kind of role, a strategic leadership role. And I'm going to be challenging and pushing kind of people here. And I think I said to my chair once I got the role, I said, look, one of my KPIs should be that I want 2 of our trustees, of our 12 trustees at that time, to kind of complain about me by the end of the year, because otherwise I'm not actually pushing you guys hard enough. It's really easy in these roles to do the same thing year after year. I think there's a little bit of lack of kind of accountability. So I deliberately said, if I'm doing the same thing, that's not what you employed me for. You employed me to kind of as a change agent, and change is going to be challenging for people. So I kind of pushed her and said, look, yeah, actually, a couple of trustees are complaining I'm pushing you guys too hard. That's a good space to be.
Like when you get out of bed in the morning, are you really focused on what you'll achieve that day, and you want to get to that quickly? Like you're less bothered about the niceties of life and people being sort of conciliatory towards you? Are you really focused on the game, getting it done?
I think you have to focus on both, right? Because you actually do have to, work. The only way we can really make an impact is with working with kind of partners, whether it's regional councils, other key stakeholders, etc. So part of that kind of strategy is, forming those partnerships and relationships and making sure that, we respect them and they respect us as well. So for me, it's good to have a team and good to have trustees that slow me down. And, I wouldn't want to have a group of trustees and staff all like myself because we would just push too hard and probably break things. And so I do need to have that team around me that kind of pulls me kind of back a little bit and slows me down and goes, yep, we need to build those relationships, etc. kind of first. So I think, you need to do a little bit of both, to be honest.
Yeah, and one of the drains of your strategy when you walked in was around impact investing, and let's pick up on that now. So it's been around forever, impact investing, although maybe not called that. Been around a long time. You've been chair of Impact Investing Network, and part of as I see from a slight distance, is one of the things is defining it, another thing promoting it, and then creating opportunity or building the capacity around it. Tell us about that role, because that's a voluntary role, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a voluntary role. So I'm the chair of the Impact Investment Network Aotearoa, which is effectively the National Advisory Board for Impact Investing in New Zealand. And obviously impact investing, most people on the call probably know, is where we're looking to get that, measurable social, environmental kind of impact alongside a financial return. And I've been in that role kind of a couple of years now, and it is something that really aligns strongly with what I believe in. And I think when I go back to it, you're right. Impact investing, it was called different things, but it's been around for generations. I go back to the, early days in England where, those factories, they didn't just actually, employ people. They built the houses for the people. They built actually schools for the people. And it's the same thing here in terms of our Māori iwi kind of communities. They don't just think about actually the employment. It's those wider kind of benefits at the same time. So impact investing is a kind of term that's been created over the last 10 years, but it has always been around. My kind of personal belief is that capitalism just diverted too much to focusing on profit and not looking at those wider impacts over the last 50 years. And we need to kind of change capitalism back to be a bit more kind of inclusive in nature. So, it does go, well, actually, there is a clear cost of greenhouse gas emissions, which haven't actually ever been kind of costed in. Actually, there is a social license that organisation needs to kind of understand, and what are the wider impacts of those kind of organisations on the community. So our National Advisory Board, or the Impact Investment Network in New Zealand, as you said, it's there to connect, educate and advocate and grow the impact investment ecosystem in New Zealand. And we'd like to think, I suppose, that, maybe there wouldn't be a role for us in 5 or 10 years' time. So if we can be that catalyst and help transition to a truly sustainable finance ecosystem, then do you really need, organisations that is focused on impact investment? Potentially not. And so, but I think at this stage, we clearly do. We need to kind of show and prove that actually you can get really good financial returns and have good impact at the same time. We need to show people that actually you can measure this kind of impact, and actually that people really care about the impact. So if you're a KiwiSaver fund manager, being able to communicate to your investors what impact you're having, or if you're a company, being able to communicate, actually it's just not financial return, it's what impact we're having on a community. I think it's going to be crucial going forward to get kind of further and further investment. So our job is to kind of grow it and get it to that stage where hopefully, the most of the ecosystem can know and understand, and there's enough kind of track record to see it's working really well. And then once we get to that sustainable finance kind of ecosystem, then do we need a role in 5 or 10 years' time? Hopefully not.
Yeah. And there's some great stuff in impact investing around innovation. So sort of creating a pathway for investments maybe to become more, enterprises to become more commercial and derive more return. But a bit that probably excites me is around the innovation. So if it's sort of depending on the where the funding's come from, it could do some really innovative stuff that could be transformative for the environment and or society without there's been a huge pressure to return funds to shareholders. But that's a bit that probably excites me. How about yourself?
Yeah, I think for me, it's that if many impact investors like ourselves and other trusts and foundations, etc., have the willingness, they really want to see the impact almost first, and it's not necessarily lowering your return expectations, but it's about taking more, like the willingness to take a little bit more risk. And I think for me, that's the interesting bit. So if we want to get commercial capital into the sector, right, it needs to have an acceptable commercially based return. So I don't think we should be compromising that much on the return, but sometimes we need to take a bit more risk and be that first mover and go, look, we'll set this up, we'll establish it, we'll show the track record of over 3 to 5 years' time. So in 3 to 5 years' time, actually, the commercial investors can come and go, oh, this is just a really good, commercial investment with really good positive impact at the same time. And then they can follow on to our investor into that investment, and we can take our money out and invest into something else. So I think it's probably less return compromise, but more willingness to embrace and take a bit more risk to help prove that proof of concept, I think.
Yeah. And we can't redo history, but just I'm taking you back to when the community finance or the community banks were being dissolved and the funds were going into these community trusts. Would it be better to actually set those community banks up as social enterprises and keep deriving the returns, or actually half of them may have fallen over by now, and actually we've ended up in a good space with close to 5 billion New Zealand dollars invested and making a difference?
It's really hard to say. So one of the community trusts, which was the Taranaki, which is now called Toi Foundation, they never sold their banks. So they still own the TSB Bank in New Zealand. And, they've done well from a, capital kind of return perspective in terms of owning that bank. Would have it been good for the ecosystem as a whole? I do believe that we needed to get more capital into the banking system in New Zealand, and those trusts weren't able to kind of put that capital in. So I think there had to be some kind of deregulation, but could have the trust still owned 30 or 40% of that kind of model? Potentially. It's a hard one to know. I think what I do know is, and do we fundamentally believe at the moment, is that the banking system in New Zealand dominated by the four big Australian banks that have their Australian rules. I don't think it is actually working that well for New Zealand Inc. as a whole. They don't know our communities as well as they should do. They struggle to lend to Māori iwi, where you can't take security kind of over the land. They are making very, very high profits in terms of actually their capital over here. And so actually having some bigger, banks, whether it's a Kiwi Bank or TSB, but I think they need to somehow be listed and have more capital into those banks that have a bit of more of a kind of social mandate to kind of compete a bit more aggressively against those Australian banks would be really kind of beneficial.
Yeah, I can see the benefit of that. And just focusing on Alastair as a leader, you as a leader, and in terms of how you operate and whether that's changed or not, but you're quite structured. Are you see you divide your time up between strategy, people, and other? How does Alastair operate?
I saw this bit of analysis, so it might have been on a leadership course I did about 5 years ago, and it's called the time value of money. And basically it kind of divides your time into kind of 4 quadrants and said, like, there's a lot of people that spend a lot of their time on doing things that kind of really aren't kind of important and really kind of add no kind of value as well. And, you kind of got to work through the kind of quadrant, and where it is that you really kind of create value is focusing on things that are really important but not kind of urgent. And so I'll probably give you an example of what I mean by that. But when I was in the Air New Zealand airline days, if there was a large, say, airline disruption, a customer disruption, right, it's really important, really urgent to get those people from wherever they're disrupted to back on another flight and get them to their final destination. Does that really create much long-term value? Probably not, because they're still going to be pissed off that they got disrupted in the first place. Where there's a real lot of value is 3 months after that incident, where it's not urgent anymore, evaluating what actually caused that incident and understanding what caused it, which might have been an engineering issue, say at the Christchurch engineering base. Fix that. Actually, that creates long-term value.
Yeah.
So I deliberately try and structure my time to spend a lot of it on things that aren't urgent, but are really, really kind of important. And I think too many people, just get trapped on in terms of the cycle of always doing things that are urgent and important, and they don't create value. So true long-term value is created. Now, when you think long-term, if you're an individual thinking now at the age of, say, if you're 30, about what are you going to do in terms of retirement and KiwiSaver, etc., actually that's not urgent, but that's really important. That's going to create immense long-term value. So I'm quite structured in terms of making sure, and it's my happy place to be. I spend a lot of time actually doing the stuff that it's actually kind of long-term, but making sure I've got a team that can kind of look after the urgent, important stuff at the same time.
And the future for Bay Trust, and what's your vision for the area, for the Bay of Plenty? I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, so our future of Bay Trust, so we have defined our purpose as accelerating bold, meaningful change, ensuring the Bay of Plenty and our communities flourish. And that is quite a action-orientated purpose statement. So we'll be lifting our granting, so we grant about $8 million a year, into more of a strategic kind of area. So less kind of ambulance at the bottom of the cliff granting, more strategic granting, especially around things like environmental initiatives and climate change and housing opportunities as well. But when I kind of think about long-term for the trust, it's actually about creating those opportunities where commercial capital can follow us. So we've invested in housing solutions for the last 8 or 9 years, through investing in kind of funds, but doing direct investment ourselves into chips, et cetera, et cetera. But where we're heading, and I think, we're going to do this in other sectors as well from a housing perspective, is going, that's all well and good, but that takes our 5 million and just limits it to 5 million. What we've done at the moment, and what we're hopefully going to launch in the next couple of months, is creating a housing equity fund for the Bay of Plenty, where our capital combined with other philanthropic and other council capital will take our 10 million or end up being 50 million. We'll combine it with debt, potentially KiwiSaver debt to $100 million, and set up in a fund and structure that says, look, you can invest into terms of long-term, really good mission-based housing solutions, which are good for our community and good for our people, and get a good commercial return. And hopefully in 3 to 5 years' time, we're at a stage where, those KiwiSaver investors can invest equity into that. And I'd like to be at a stage where, say a KiwiSaver, because that's where the big capital in New Zealand is, can go out to the members and say, look, you're based in the Bay of Plenty. Would you like to allocate 1 or 2% of your KiwiSaver balance to a local Bay of Plenty housing-based fund, doing great things in your community and have us a really good, strong track record to return? So I think, we're doing that in the housing space, and I think the next one will look to do something in the climate change environmental space. But, creating funds or structures that are investable for other commercial entities, say the large, whether it's a Forsyth Bar or a Craig's or a KiwiSaver fund, getting them involved right at the start to help co-design so that they could potentially invest down the track in the future when we've got the strong track record kind of established. So that's kind of where I see Bay Trust kind of leading the place, because we know our granting's not going to make a difference. When we survey our community, it's climate change and housing, etc., the big issues, and our granting alone is never going to make a difference in that space.
Yeah, and that's learnings you've had from the research and just being out there in the community as well. Wonderful. And in terms of your role in that, so you've been in the role 8 years. Yeah, on a personal note, like you got your chairman role and you're fully involved in impact investing, but continuity for Bay Trust, does that even come up as an issue in your mind?
Yeah, we have a lot of discussions around, not being a large team, we're only sort of 5-6 of us in a team. It's hard to have proper succession planning when you've got a small team like that, but we all have a number of discussions on that, but also kind of leave coverage. So, what would happen if I get hit in the bus? I like to think that I've got kind of mana enhancing leadership. So if I get hit by the bus, actually, there shouldn't be any drop off in the performance of Bay Trust. Actually, all the team would kind of step up and you shouldn't even notice I've actually gone. So we take kind of that mentality coming through. And then for me personally, as I said, I've been there. I gave a commitment when I took the role, I'd be there somewhere between 5 and kind of 10 years. I still think there's a little bit to achieve. I want to get this housing equity fund across the line, maybe an environmental fund, like something like that, get it across the line. And then, just explore other opportunities. As you said, I'm doing this chair role. I think there's a few more kind of board appointment roles kind of coming up that I might be interested in as well, and just explore those and make sure I've got the capacity and capability in the team that says that, when the right time for me to leave is, or when if I get hit by a bus, that Bay Trust can continue as strong, if not stronger, without me in the chair, in the role.
Wonderful. Also, thank you very much for joining me on Purposely.
No worries at all.
Thanks for listening to Purposely Podcast. Please subscribe and leave a review. I hope you like what you're hearing, because I sure do.